Hey guys, it's Shannon from Indoor Shannon, and I am responding to a reader question today. My longtime friend Ray had a question about commercial patterns, and her question was, when you go pick up one of these patterns, one of the big four like McCall's, Simplicity, Vogue, or Butterick, and you get home and you lay your pattern piece out on your fabric, you'll find that there's all these different cut lines right over here. And she wanted to know, are those cut lines the fabric cut lines or are those the stitching lines? And the answer is those are the fabric cut lines. The seam allowance is already built in to these commercial patterns, and it's typically a 5/8 inch seam allowance for most of the big four patterns that you would find. And the way that you can double check if the seam allowance is in there is on the pattern paper that comes with it. Right down here, it tells you seam allowance. And on there, not only is it going to tell you what the seam allowance is for the pattern, but it usually mentions whether or not it's already included. This one says 5/8 inch seam allowance included unless otherwise indicated, but not printed on the tissue. And what that means is this line is the fabric cut line. It's not the stitching line that's marked, that seam allowance. So go ahead and just cut out your fabric using these lines for your pattern size and then sew it up with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Now, the only time that I would say that's not true is if you're using a Burda style pattern. And any patterns from their website or anything that you trace off from their magazines does not have the seam allowance included in, and you will need to add it. Now, I should probably put a little disclaimer in that although I have never come across one of these patterns without the seam allowance added in, they might exist. So you do want to make sure and check that on that part in the instructions and make sure that it does say that they are included. But I have yet to come across one that doesn't. As far as indie designers go, most of them have built in their seam allowances, but again, it will be mentioned usually at the beginning of the first 2 or 3 pages when it's describing the pattern and it tells you what the seam allowance is. And just a little side note, if you are sewing indie patterns, they typically do not use the 5/8 inch seam allowance that the big four companies use. They usually use a 1/2 inch or 1/4 inch or 3/8 inch, kind of depending on the designer. A lot of the ones I see are a 1/2 inch as their standard seam allowance size. So make sure you're paying attention to that on your patterns and make sure you are cutting the right size. I could do a whole nother question and answer post on the size part of a pattern. But that's it for today, and thank you, Ray, for your question. I'll be back tomorrow to answer your second question that you had for me, and thanks so much for sending them in. They're great questions. Have a great night.